Welcome, everyone. I hope you enjoy the story of Peaches and Daddy. This fantastic story of Edward West Browning is the perfect example of money can't buy you love. The lavish and over-the-top lifestyle he showered on the women in his life was simply unbelievable. To understand the opulence of his life, we have to go back to April 14, 1950, and the wedding announcement to 23-year-old Nellie Adele Lowen marrying Edward. At that time, he's 41 years of age, a multi-millionaire, and one of New York City's most eligible bachelors. The announcement was in all the papers. Miss Adele Lowen, daughter of Charles H. Lowen, was married yesterday to Edward West Browning, son of the late Franklin Browning, founder of the firm of Browning, King and Company, and the nephew of the late J. Hull Browning, one-time president of the Erie Railroad. The couple will honeymoon in the Southwest. Upon their return, they will live at 35 West 81st Street, Manhattan. The entire top floor, consisting of 2 apartments of 20 rooms, will be remodeled for their use. The roof will suggest an oriental garden, in the center of which will be a lake stocked with fish, including some to be imported from Japan. There will, however, be an accidental feature in a miniature golf course, as Mr. and Mrs. Browning are devoted to the sport. Everything seemed rosy for the couple, and then in March 1916, articles hit the papers all over the country. New Yorker plans to fly to his office daily. Edward West Browning, constructor of skyscrapers and self-confessed nut on modernity, is shortly to fly to business and back daily. Frequently, Mrs. Browning expects to fly with him. Fancy Mr. Browning, as he lights his breakfast cigar, saying, "James, is the flying machine ready?" "Motor humming, thank you, sir." Then James assists him into his puttees and belted jacket, cap, and goggles, and he will go up to the roof of the 20-story Orvis apartment house on West 81st Street, where he lives, and mount his winged carrier. In about a minute's swooping, if everything goes well, he will land on the roof of the 30-story World Tower building of his construction at 110 West 40th Street and be busy at his desk within 2 minutes of the time of lighting his after-breakfast cigar a mile away. Of course, considerable of a roof is required from which to get the proper scuttling start for the monoplane or biplane. This Mr. Browning possesses. "Yes, sir," said Mr. Browning. "That's exactly what I intend to do. Fly to business and back every day. Anyway, every pleasant day." Why not? This article was written in 1920, 5 years after he married Adele. Edward West Browning is the only man in New York who can take a row or a swim in a lake 12 stories above the street level, with the blue sky above and Central Park and Manhattan Square below. The lake is in a garden of 10,000 geraniums, which covers the entire roof of the 75-foot wide apartment house at 31, 33, and 35 West 81st Street. It was because Mr. and Mrs. Browning desired to make Dorothy Lane, a little lady of 3 years old, their own, that the story of the lake and the ingeniously arranged home of the Brownings came to light. The judge who held the power to deny or approve the supplications of Mr. and Mrs. Browning for the right to the parentage of the little girl asked, as is natural in such matters, the character of the home they would provide for the child. There was nothing for Mr. Browning to do but lay the wonders of his home overlooking Central Park and Manhattan Square and the Museum of Natural History before the judge, who was startled by the story told. A fairyland home. The home of Mr. Browning described, and which, he said, was now shared by another little girl adopted a few years ago, is like a fairyland home. Lake, flowers, gardens, songbirds, bubbling fountains, thousands and thousands of electric lamps of variegated colors, and all sizes, temple bells and lanterns from old Japan, art treasures, and ingenious arrangements that transform the 24 rooms which stretch across the top floor of the building into bits of Oriental and Occidental splendor, were some of the things that, he told the judge, awaited little Miss Dorothy. Mr. Browning is the son of the founder of the firm of Browning, King and Company, and is himself one of the leading real estate men of the city, having built many spectacular structures, tall hotels on narrow sites, and cloud-piercing loft buildings, one of which is the World Tower on 40th Street near Broadway, which is the tallest loft building in the world. Sunshine Garden and Paradise Garden are the names Mr. Brown has given his home atop of New York. The roof development, which includes the lake and the 33 flower beds, is known as Sunshine Garden, and the formal residence, which is on the top floor of the apartment house, goes by the name of Paradise Garden. The creation of this novel home has cost a fortune, besides considerable time and labor on the part of artists, designers, and skilled workmen of the foremost rank in this country and Europe. Sunshine Garden is perhaps the most novel home in all New York. In the first place, a lake within a home, large enough to permit a boat to be rowed about, is distinctly unusual. The lake is several feet deep and is the sporting ground for hundreds of goldfishes and other kinds, some of which are 8 and 10 inches long. Birdmen in this part of the country must have seen Mrs. Browning in her boat on the lake. Now that summer is rapidly approaching, Sunshine Garden is being prepared for sweltering nights. The Brownings and their guests often spend the warm evenings up there in the path of the cooling breezes which come across Central Park or from the Hudson River. The garden in summer is fairyland, both day and night. The 33 flower beds, more than 10,000 geraniums banked about the lake, make a pretty picture. At one end of the lake is a sundial, and at the other is a 16-inch crystal. At night the place is lighted with colored lights. The lake becomes a pool of fire, and over it hangs a rainbow. A steady spray of water is shot into the air for each side of the lake. Shining through the water are the colored rays from 250 candle power lamps. In through the trellis, the flower beds, and on the arches in the garden, wink and blink little electric lamps representing fireflies and stars. The full-page article goes on to elaborate on the extravagance of the paradise. One of the 6 Japanese rooms, for instance, has walls adorned in black silk, on which birds have been worked in silver or are painted. 3 rooms were connected to make the dining room, which boasts a large bronze fountain. The fairyland has a room for 250 songbirds. The living room contains a lighted waterfall. All this to impress and adopt little Dorothy Sunshine. All seems to be going well in paradise. In 1920, the little daughter that they're adopting together is called Dorothy. The other little daughter that they adopted a few years ago, according to the article, her name is Marjorie, and she was adopted by Adele. Edward, Nellie Adele, little Marjorie, and Dorothy Sunshine were the perfect American family and living in paradise. They were successful, affluent, and without a care in the world, you would think. Until Adele began to spend too much time at her dentist's office. This article showed up in August 1923 in the South Bend Tribune. Edward W. Browning, the well-known New York millionaire, had never noticed anything seriously wrong with his wife's teeth. They were, he had always thought, ever since their courtship days, very lovely and exceptionally sound bits of bone and spotless enamel, just the sort to adorn such a pretty face as hers. For such cleaning and other routine attention as they needed from time to time, she went to the dentist to whom he always went, a reliable and elderly dental surgeon who had served the Browning family for a long time. Quite naturally, then, Mr. Browning was a little surprised when he began receiving bills for work on his wife's teeth from a dentist of whom he had never heard, Dr. Charles H. Weiland. But he was quite ready to pay them when his wife told him how badly her teeth needed attention and how much more gentle and painstaking this new dentist was than the one who had always served the Browning family. The bills were frequent, and their amounts were large, but Mr. Browning, successful businessman that he is, did not think them too large in view of the intricate dental work his wife was apparently having done. But now Mr. Browning thinks that those dentist bills, for which he so cheerfully sent checks, were the most outrageous a husband ever paid, for he believes that along with the money Dr. Weiland took from him, the dentist also took the heart of his beautiful young wife. What Mr. Browning alleges to have been the sensational sequel to the attentions his wife received on her frequent visits to the dentist's office came on June 30, when she sailed for Europe on the steamship Olympic under an assumed name. On the Olympic also sailed Charles H. Weiland, DDS, initials which, in the lively circles of Greenwich Village, where he was a familiar figure, were factitiously interpreted to mean devilish dental chic. The day the Olympic sailed was the day set for the removal of the Brownings and their adopted daughters from their palatial 24-room apartment covering the whole top floor of a New York skyscraper to their country place in the Long Island suburb of Forest Hill. Late that afternoon, Mr. Browning hurried from his office, eager to see how his family was getting settled in the new home. To his amazement, he found that his wife was neither at the Forest Hills house nor at the city apartment, and that little Marjorie, the elder of the adopted daughters, was also missing. The child was later found living with Mrs. Browning's parents, and they refused to give her up to the father. Detectives whom the millionaire called to his aid soon established the fact that Mrs. Browning and the dentist had sailed on the Olympic, she under an assumed name. Before the Olympic reached Europe, detectives in the millionaire's employ were waiting at the pier to identify the wife and the dentist and to shadow them wherever they went. The reports from this little army of sleuths confirmed the millionaire's belief that all those visits to the dentist's office had robbed him of his wife, and that her secret flight to Europe on the same steamer with Dr. Weiland was nothing less than an elopement. The doctor's subsequent declarations that the fact of his having been a fellow voyager with Mrs. Browning was merely a coincidence, and her assertion that she had gone to Paris only to secure a quiet divorce from her husband shook the latter's first opinion, not to the slightest. To me, my wife is as though she were dead, he says. I wish I could only have thought of more things to do for her while she was mine, he said sadly. As it was, I gave her everything money could buy and all my love and affection. But she left me for another man. I wish them luck. Dr. Weiland is a man of 28 years. Mrs. Browning is 31. And Mr. Browning is 56 years old. The Brownings had been married 8 years. In spite of the difference in their ages, their life, until the dentist stepped in, seemed to be an everlasting honeymoon. The prodigal luxuries with which Mr. Browning surrounded his young wife and their 2 daughters had long been the talk of New York. The article goes on to talk about Dr. Weiland and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Renee Shapiro. She has a lot to say about the affair. She says, I was engaged to marry Weiland, says Miss Shapiro. He told me he did not love Mrs. Browning, and that she was only a good friend because she had money. He told me that he planned to have me go to Mrs. Browning and tell her that I had seen her with him and that I was his fiancée and that I was going to tell Mr. Browning. And then Wyland figured out that Mrs. Browning would become frightened and run to him for advice, and he would tell her it was the best plan to pay me off, to shut my mouth. Wyland had another plan, which was for me to meet Mr. Browning, and then after a while, when I was with Browning, for Wyland to come in by surprise and to say that I was his wife and that there was going to be trouble. And then Mr. Browning was to pay a large sum of money to keep it quiet. Wyland got money from Mrs. Browning. I have seen hundreds of dollars that he said she gave him, and I saw the 2 diamond rings she gave him, and the money he got when he pawned them. What a pathetic turn of fortune's wheel it would be for Mrs. Browning if it should turn out that she had been as badly victimized by the dentist's kisses as her husband was by his bills. In forsaking her husband under any conditions, she has certainly taken a great risk, for such love and luxury as he claims to have lavished on her are not easy to duplicate, not even for a woman of her youth and beauty. The newspapers covered the affair ad nauseum. Nellie Adele was considered a Cinderella shopgirl who broke her millionaire husband's heart, as in this article entitled, "Millionaire and the Shopgirl Who Broke His Heart." Cinderella became a bird in a gilded cage with an Arabian Nights roof. She grew bored with the devotion of her $10 million husband and serenity in the most remarkable living quarters in the world, and she eloped with the dentist chic. One article made it look as though the stress from all the publicity caused her to age, as in this article from 1923. This one is from 1924. She still looks pretty in this photo. In 1926, Adele was facing charges for passport fraud from the time she went to Paris. The photo is very unbecoming. She and Wyland were in Paris living the high life on Browning's money as Mr. and Mrs. Wolsher. In May 1924, a Paris judge granted Browning his divorce on the grounds of incompatibility. He was free. He soon landed on his feet and began a nationwide search for a big sister for little Dorothy Sunshine. Little Dorothy Sunshine lives in the lap of luxury. She has footmen at her beck and call. She has a chauffeur. She has all kinds of servants. When little Dorothy wants to go for a ride, she says, "Please, I would like to go driving. I wish my car." "Which car?" the question comes. "Your Pierce, your imported French Landaulet, or your new Rolls-Royce?" "Oh, just the Pierce," the child often replies. "I only wish to run about. I won't go in style today." But when Miss Dorothy rides in any of her $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000 cars, she takes her entertainment with her. Mr. Browning has seen to that. If little Miss Browning wishes to see moving pictures, she touches one cleverly arranged button, this time not of pearl but of platinum and seed diamonds. And right in front of her, on a screen which unfolds behind a deft little cupboard, a screen is stretched, and then 5 reel films of Mary Pickford or Charlie Chaplin or Douglas Fairbanks or Anita Stewart are revealed as the child is sped along Long Island roads in any one of her 3 spectacular cars. Now, almost any little girl of 9 would consider a drive in a beautiful big automobile which was entirely her own fun enough. And if the average little 9-year-old also had a real moving picture show traveling about with her, the films changed twice weekly, she would undoubtedly consider herself the most fortunate little girl in the world. But Dorothy Browning's imagination did not stop with her 3 cars, nor her traveling movies, for she spoke of a phonograph. I like opera and popular music as well. Jazz, Papa. But when I want to hear music in the car, I never can. I just have to wait till I get home." And the millionaire, with the imagination, brought down his hand with a bang. "That shall be changed at once. When my little girl wants music, she shall have it, at home or in her car." And Mr. Browning bought a marvelous traveling phonograph, which he had ordered specially made. And for a while Dorothy Browning was satisfied. Then one day she again spoke to her fond father. "Of course I like my 3 cars, and of course I am grateful for my moving pictures and my phonograph. But, Father, I never can hear a real living concert when I'm traveling. Often there's something very fine given in New York when I'm driving with you through Westchester, or when I'm on the road down to our Long Island estate. But I miss the music because there's no such thing as a traveling radio." And again Papa Browning put down his hand in emphasis and called in the engineers and the scientists, all men who specialize in radios. And they built this little 9-year-old girl a 9-tube radio equipped so that its notes are free of vibration, even when the car is traveling at 40 miles an hour. And Dorothy Browning was satisfied for a while, but only a little while. Then one evening she made her last request of all, and her most important. The final thing that little Dorothy asked for was a big sister. She said she was lonely and wanted a sister. So Daddy Browning is going to get her one. So millionaire Daddy Browning put this wanted ad on the inside page of several metropolitan newspapers. Wanted: a young lady, 12 years old, for adoption, a child with ambition, a girl who knows or is willing to learn how to swim, ride horseback, skate, dance, fish, and play the piano. This child will be the sister and companion to a little girl who attends a private school in New York and divides her time between a Fifth Avenue apartment and a Long Island estate. Only the socially ambitious need apply. Poverty and humility a present place in life, no handicap. Beauty is not essential. In fact, beauty is one of the qualifications least considered. Apply to Edward Browning, number 153 West 72nd Street, New York City. Over. As you can imagine, he received thousands of replies to his ad. Of course, he toiled over them until one picture and letter impressed him the most. It was written by 16-year-old Mary Louise Spaz. So very quickly, Mary Spaz became his foster child while the adoption proceedings took place. She received all the attention and luxuries Browning's other adopted daughter, Dorothy Sunshine, received. The Rolls Royce was at her beck and call, and she was showered with shopping trips to buy gowns and jewelry. A true dream come true for any Cinderella. But alas, it was short-lived, for she had lied about her age. Instead of a girl of 16, she was a woman of 21. As you can imagine, everyone was devastated. Mary for being caught in her lie and losing her new fairy tale life. And little Dorothy Sunshine for again losing a sister. And Edward Browning for being lied to and made a fool of. The newspapers had a heyday with this information. Some short clips follow. Edward West Browning, who sought to play fairy godfather to Mary Louise Spaz, was sadder and wiser today, after Mary Louise left his home, lured by promises of new riches extended by newspapers and moving picture producers. Edward West Browning, the New York millionaire who spent $20,000 on Mary Louise after her adoption to learn she was more than 21 years of age. He returned her to her home and now seeks annulment of the adoption so she cannot seek part of his fortune. Rich Daddy in tears, bows to opinion, he says. Edward W. Browning, multimillionaire realtor, yesterday relinquished his claim as the legal foster father of Mary Louise Spas after a conference with the District Attorney Newcomb in Long Island City Courthouse. Mary was allowed to carry away from her apartment in the Kew Gardens Inn thousands of dollars worth of personal attire and ornaments, gifts of Browning purchased on shopping tours last week. The fairyland that golden-haired, apple-cheeked Mary Spas conjured up out of her dreams collapsed under a shower of legal language in Long Island City Courthouse yesterday when the reluctant decision of Edward W. Browning, multimillionaire realtor, to relinquish his claim to her adoption changed the gilded coach of New York's modern Cinderella back into a hollow pumpkin. Edward Browning told one reporter, "I am sitting here today, a lonely man surrounded by letters from thousands of girls who want to be adopted. But I'm through. Their pictures are beautiful. Some of their letters are very wistful. But my experience with Mary Louise has taught me a lesson. All I wanted to do was spread sunshine in the world. Instead, I was made the victim of a cyclone. You can say for me, never again. The fairy godfather has found his last Cinderella." This photograph was taken just a couple of weeks later. Do you recognize Mary Spas now as a 21-year-old woman? Soon, Mary Spas was just a bad memory, if memories can sue you for $500,000. We'll let the lawyers handle that. We're going to fast forward 3 months to March 1926. Edward Browning was attending a sorority dance, a sorority that he founded. The sorority consisted of 20 girls, and they all called him Daddy. So from now on, we're going to call him Daddy. At the dance, he met a 15-year-old girl named Frances Heenan. And the rest is history. After a whirlwind courtship, they got married. And by whirlwind, I mean about a month. Before they got married, a very mysterious thing happened to Peaches. An article speaks about it. It's entitled, "Story of Acid Throwing." Peaches' mother had left the apartment early Saturday morning and snapped both locks on the outside door, taking double precaution to protect the lovely Frances, who weighs 145 pounds without her overcoat and has so many boyfriends, all conspiring to thwart her education. Frances was still asleep. Shortly after she had gone, Mr. Browning called Frances on the telephone. There was a short conversation, and then Baby went back to bed. It was only a few minutes after that when somebody slid into the apartment and threw acid at the sleeping girl. Some time later, she awoke. Frances telephoned her mother, who rushed home and called Dr. Howard Fox, a specialist in Manhattan. The burns were not serious, the physician stated. In fact, they seemed peculiar. They were localized. That is, they were on certain parts of her face, never near her eyes, and did not seem the result of a vindictive despoiler. Dr. Fox's secretary said that the doctor was not yet convinced that the acid had been thrown at her, or whether Frances had done the job herself. And very carefully, too. Just a little acid here and there, but not enough to spoil her beauty, really. Mrs. Heenan refused to let the reporters see Baby. I don't think the burns were very serious, because 36 days after they met, on April 10, 1926, Browning and Peaches went with her parents to Cold Springs, New York, and were married by the village garage owner, who also was a justice of the peace. They spent their honeymoon in a 20-room house in Cold Springs with interludes at the Bronxville Hotel. Later, they moved to Long Island and during the summer motored to Montreal. The Daily News published the first authorized story of the romantic courtship and marriage. Frances Peaches Browning When I first met the splendid man who is now my bridegroom, I thought what a tall, handsome, stately, splendid fellow he was. At the first glance, I felt unbounded admiration for him. I always did like his type of masculinity. It was only last night that Daddy confessed his first impressions of me. He said he thought at once what a darling little girl I was. He says he regarded me as the most charming person of my sex he had ever met. Really, our romance was a true case of love at first sight. I met my daddy-lover husband at a dance in the McAlpine Hotel March 5. When I saw him, I was thrilled to my innermost depths. All the girls were rushing up to be introduced as soon as he entered. I thought if I stood back and was not too anxious, he might perhaps notice me. And notice her, he did. This gleaming Rolls-Royce, with liveried footman and chauffeur to match, was one of the many expensive whims of Peaches that Browning delighted to humor during their early honeymoon days. This picture shows the Brownings, then in their first week of marriage, leaving the Bronxville Hotel for a shopping tour. Peaches was lavished with gowns and jewels, anything her heart desired. She was admired by young women everywhere. But as you can imagine, the marriage was doomed to fail, a 15-year-old girl and a 52-year-old man. Not to mention, Daddy also got her mother in the mix. I doubt if Peaches was a good mother to Dorothy because of her young age, or even a big sister for that matter. I believe Peaches was totally consumed in her own fulfillment to be concerned with his adopted daughter. Now things start getting ugly. Let's go back a little bit. March 5, 1926, Browning meets Frances Heenan, 15-year-old girl, at a dance. April 10, they're married. October 4th, Mrs. Browning leaves her husband. October 16th, Daddy Browning sues for separation. 2 days later, Peaches sues for separation. November 22, 1926, Mrs. Browning granted $300 a week alimony and $8,500 counsel fees pending trial for their consolidated suit. Well, that's going to drag on for years. So, in the meantime, we're going to forget about trials and we're going to get into Peaches' plastic surgery. The first of many articles. This one's entitled, Peaches to be Burbanked. Burbank improved the looks of the potato, and now Dr. H.J. Shireson, Chicago plastic surgeon, plans to enhance the beauty of Peaches, less well known as Frances Heenan Browning, bride of Daddy. Her plans to appear in vaudeville depended on the outcome of the operation to remedy acid scars on her face and arm, and treatment to reduce the size of her calves. This photo was showing him examining her scars. The next article is Peaches to have her legs reduced for stage career. March 30th. Frances Peaches Browning, who plans a dancing engagement in Chicago, also is planning to give her audiences a spectacular treat. She's getting a new pair of legs. Well, maybe not exactly new, but entirely remodeled and beautified through the art of the plastic surgeon, Dr. Henry J. Shireson of Chicago. He is attending to this project for Peaches, and it is said that he intends to make her legs his masterpiece. The trouble with the famous Peaches legs is that they are too thick. What Dr. Shireson plans to do is remove 3 pounds of fat from each of Peaches' sturdy pillars of support, so that when she appears in Chicago spotlight, if she is permitted to appear there, she will be able to wear short skirts without embarrassment. In addition, Dr. Shireson is to remove the scars from Peaches' face caused by the acid burns just before she married her wealthy daddy, and both operations are to be bloodless, which I don't see how that's possible. Bloodless. This photo shows Peaches undergoing the operation to remove the scars. Her mother lends her support as Peaches is only 16 years old. Dr. Shireson was very famous and used many questionable techniques in his practice. You could say he was the guru to the stars at the time. The next photos are the before and after shots. The scars are obviously enhanced for drama. As you can see, Peaches was very beautiful. She worked in vaudeville shows in 1928. This article said, Peaches Browning, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of this week, the most talked about girl in the world will appear as a feature on the vaudeville bill at the B.F. Keith Theater. She was very popular. She was world famous just because she married Daddy Browning. Well, Peaches landed on her feet. Let's see what Daddy Browning's doing. This article's entitled, Dances with Pretty Girls. Browning, in spite of his age, which he modestly sets at 52, belying the peculiar waxiness of his skin and the flaccidity of his jowl, still is a familiar figure in nightclubs and cabarets, where, applauded by admiring audiences, he stages exhibition dances with pretty girls, young enough to be his granddaughters. Right now, in addition to the separation suit brought against him by his wife Peaches, aided and abetted by her mother, a large, ferret-eyed woman with an acid tongue, both of whom are determined to wrest from him more alimony than $300 a week, he faces a suit of $100,000 brought by Renee Shapiro, an actress who alleges that he assaulted her. Renee Shapiro was the girlfriend of the dentist his first wife ran off with. She's still coming around. She's still suing. And also a $500,000 suit brought by Mary Louise Spas, the 21-year-old girl posing as 16, whom he almost adopted before Peaches toddled into his life. Daddy Browning goes out and has a good time, while the lawyers handle all the lawsuits. This article is from December 1927. Daddy plays Santa. What'll you have? Dolls, autos, and trains. Yours for the asking. Come Joan and pink-cheeked Polly, sweet May and Eleanor. The hall is decked with holly, and Daddy's at the door. A beardless Santa Claus with a roguish grin, a little double chin, and a pair of broad, tailor-made shoulders that might well get stuck in any man's chimney, arose with a yelp in the frivolous 40s yesterday to lead all the good little boys and girls into the land of milk and honey. The new prophet who has nailed many a dumb damsel under the mistletoe and kissed her in her tracks is none other than our old friend Edward West Browning of Peaches fame. In December of 1928, police were called as boys and girls fight for toys. 30 children are pushed through window in seeking presents. Traffic is halted. Trinkets run short, and mothers faint. 200,000 children gather, riot in pens when Daddy tries to play Santa Claus. A dapper, spatted, gray-haired man tried to play Santa Claus to thousands of New York children today, and before it was all over, he had to call out police riot squads merely because some of the urchins doubted he had 750,000 presents. The Santa Claus was Edward West, Daddy Browning, the real estate man whose fancy for adopted young girls and his marriage to one of them have brought him more yards of publicity than almost any other man in New York. Undaunted by Saturday's riot, in which several thousand children fought, mothers fainted, and some were cut in a crash through a window, Browning again threw his office open to children this morning, but the crowds were less than on Saturday. The first ones arrived about 8 o'clock instead of 6, as on the first gift day. Police reserves were on the job to prevent the reoccurrence of the riots. Daddy enjoyed his fame and his money until October 1934. Browning, 60, whose life, loves, and eccentricities wrote a unique chapter in America's jazz age, died at his Scarsdale home today. That would be October 12th. Only one of the numerous women who figured prominently in his life was there, and I wonder if you could guess who it was. It was his little daughter, Dorothy Sunshine Browning. She had since grown up and got married to a Mr. Hood. He was known for being a millionaire real estate operator and, of course, playboy in his love for very young girls. Mr. Browning was stricken with a cerebral hemorrhage last June 23rd and was removed to his home a month ago. His death was attributed to heart failure complicated by pneumonia and uremia. Edward Browning had a flamboyant funeral. His coffin was covered with 3,000 purple orchids. Dorothy Sunshine attended, as did his first bride, Nellie Adele. Peaches was not present. In 1937, Peaches settled her claim to the estate and was rewarded handsomely as Daddy's legal widow. Dorothy didn't settle her claim until 1941. She and her husband benefited greatly from Daddy's estate, and lawyers and charity also made a fortune. Peaches went on to marry 3 more wealthy men. In August 1956, Peaches was found unconscious on the bathroom floor in an apartment where she lived with her mother. Mrs. Heenan called the doctor because of Peaches' history of epilepsy, alcoholism, and malnutrition. When the doctor visited at around 5 p.m., she discovered a bump over Peaches' right ear. The doctor called an ambulance. Peaches never regained consciousness. An autopsy was performed, and they came to the conclusion that she died from injuries sustained from the fall. Peaches was 46. The simple Christian Science services were held at a Manhattan funeral parlor. The time and place were kept secret to keep curiosity seekers away. In December 1958, an auction was held to settle the estate of Peaches Browning. Advanced appraisals on her trinkets that she had collected in her front page career of 4 marriages had ranged up to $250,000. Gem dealers did most of the bidding and buying. The sales room was filled with women about the age of Peaches. Peaches willed her estate to her mother, Mrs. Heenan, who made her home in San Carlos, a suburb of San Francisco. If we learn anything from the life of Edward Daddy Browning and all his Cinderellas, is that money can buy you material things, and they'll give you happiness for a while, but money certainly can't buy you love. I hope you enjoyed this story. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.